My guest today is Jon Wilks. He's a musician who has really inspired me. He's a fantastic guitar player. He researches and sings traditional music as well as writing his own. He's also somebody who was kind enough to help me with my own album, with some of the technical issues that I was having. And it's a great honour to have him be my guest tonight. However, the genius that I am meant that I didn't turn my camera on until partway through the interview, so I do apologise for the still image for a short while we get things warmed up. Hopefully I'll get better at this over time. Enjoy the interview. I'd like to introduce Jon Wilks.
Hello there.
I wanted to chat with you because I think we share kind of fairly similar tastes in music and in guitarists and all that sort of thing, but I think we also have kind of had more deeper conversations about things rather than just the technical side of guitars and things like that. So I thought it would be nice to share some of that with the viewers.
Absolutely.
So most people, I suppose, these days at least, will know you from your work as a singer of songs, of bringing back songs from Birmingham. That's definitely how I came across you. But I think there's more to it than that. But do you want to sort of talk about a bit about that and why that happened? And
Well, it happened because I'm from Birmingham. I suppose that's the first point. I mean, I think a lot of people who perhaps are from Birmingham would tease me for saying that. I was born in Solihull, so I was born on the. I always say I was actually born in Warwickshire. At the time that I was born, all those years ago, Solihull was actually in Warwickshire, and then a few years after I was born, it moved into, I suppose, what's Greater Birmingham. Nothing to do with me. It wasn't my fault that they shifted it, but they moved it over, and so I kind of grew up. It's easier to say I grew up in the West Midlands, so I'm a Midlands lad, really. I don't have much of a Birmingham accent. It comes out occasionally if I'm around Brummy people, but not terribly strong. And I was always, as a child, I think I was always sort of recognised by friends' parents as being the posh kid who didn't have much of a Brummy accent. So for better or for worse. But anyway, I lived in Birmingham, like most people. I lived in Birmingham up until the age of 18, when I left, went off to university, and didn't really come back. I mean, I came back a little bit and lived at my parents after university, very, very briefly, and then I went off abroad, and I lived abroad for a long time, and I sort of started a career in media and started a career as a journalist, and that's a whole other thing. But I say a whole other thing, but very much connected to a lot of what I do anyway.
yeah.
But the Birmingham thing was a weird one. So when I'd found my way into traditional music, which again is a slightly different story that perhaps we can go into in a minute, but when I'd found my way into traditional music, one of the things that fascinated me, and I know it fascinates a lot of other people who are interested or starting to find an interest in traditional music, is this idea that it can be geolocated very easily. That you can really find songs that come from a specific neck of the woods or a specific place, and it kind of, I think for a lot of people, when they realize that and they start realizing that these are songs that date to way back, but also to sort of from the very specific place that they come from, that becomes a very kind of rooting thing, and it gives you a real sense of place and a real sense of origin, in a sense. And so when I was starting to look at that and starting to become interested in the way that traditional music did that, the natural thing was to have a look at where I came from. There weren't terribly many songs from the specific neck of the woods that I came from. The first song that I came across that was even close to where I came from an area of Birmingham that I only remember because it was the first ever place where there was a drive-through McDonald's. That's the only thing that I remembered about it at all. And I was like, wow, it's got its own little song. That's a song called Colin's Ghost, and it was sort of it was so disconnected with my memory of that place. It kind of amused me. But I went on this little journey and I started finding out about songs. And as I often say when I'm performing live, one of the times I went back to Birmingham, it was probably about 15 years after I'd properly lived there, and I went back with my kids, and we got off the train at Birmingham Station, which is now called Grand Central. It was called New Street Station when I was a kid.
Yeah.
We got off the station and I was completely lost. I stepped out into the street and I just had no idea where I was. It took me ages to locate myself, and my kids were sort of like, hey, "Are you really from Birmingham? Is this all a ruse?" And we were going to a Birmingham City Museum, the City of Birmingham Museum rather than Birmingham City Football Museum. And we were going there, and one of the first things that I found when I got there was this wall of buttons where you could press and listen to songs that came from the area. And as somebody who was interested in music, that was clearly something I was going to do. And the first song that I heard was this song called "I Can't Find Brummagem," which starts with the lines, "Full 20 years or more have passed since I left Brummagem." And it's all about a man who goes back after many, many years and can't find his way around, gets completely lost. And it was just far too serendipitous to leave that alone. And it took me on a little journey. I ended up researching a lot of traditional songs from the Midlands, and ended up recording that album that I called Midlife, partly because I recorded it when I was 40 years old, and partly because I came from the Midlands. Obvious title, really.
Yeah.
And that is a very long answer to your first question.
No, that's great. I think, people very often consider folk music and traditional music to be something of an old person's pursuit. And I kind of have a flash through my head now that I'm actually not that young anymore and I'm well into my middle age. But, it's something that very odd that I couldn't define, that draws you to a song or draws you to a thing. And I think you mentioned that, kind of drew you to this song because it sort of told your story of someone coming back to where you were born and not really knowing it. Is it that how you kind of choose the songs, because they kind of have a resonance for you or they have some emotional attachment?
Well, first of all, you're right. I think that people do. Not always. I mean, I know quite a few, younger people who clearly get into traditional music at a very young age. Yeah. I also know quite a few people who've got into traditional music around the age that I did, which I suppose was my late 30s. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that a lot of that has to do with perhaps reaching a point in your life where you start sort of looking at who you are or where you come from and that kind of thing. Somebody said to me, it comes to us all in the end, death, taxes and folk music. And I think that's kind of a good quote. And it made sense to me at the time that I started getting interested in it. And certainly it was a journey for me. And I'm talking now about before I made the Birmingham album. I made an album, one album of traditional songs, mostly traditional songs before that. And that was really me. I suppose, as I say, there's an element there of finding out who I am, and very much in the case of my story, I was drawn because of my own ancestors. So I found out. Well, I kind of knew it. It's a funny thing. I would hear traditional tunes, and there was just something about them that was attractive and familiar to me, and almost comforting in their familiarity. And I couldn't really work out for the life of me why that was. Why did I kind of feel like I knew these songs? And I was talking to my uncle, who was a bit of a folkie, and he told me that my grandparents had actually met because my grandfather was a Morris dancer from up Durham way, and my grandmother was also a dancer and a concertina player. And I've recently found out that my grandmother once moved to an entirely different city because she quite liked the style of Morris dancing that they did. So it was far more deeply rooted in my own personal story than I had known. And the place that kept coming up in these conversations was this place called Cecil Sharp House, which is in Camden and is the
Right.
headquarters of the English Folk Dance and Song Society, the EFDAS as it's known.
Hmm.
And I knew a bit about that because in my career I'd been a music journalist. So I knew about people like the Watersons. Certainly knew a lot about Martin Carthy. I remember at university listening
Right.
to Martin Carthy when everybody else was listening to things like the Spice Girls and stuff like that. And apparently I had the bad taste. That's what they
Hmm.
used to tell
Yeah.
me. And
That's
but
right.
I knew that those people had been drawn to this building, Cecil Sharp House, and that they'd gone there and they'd found these sort of ancient songs and they'd kind of breathed life into them. And so
Mm.
when I realised that my grandparents had met there and courted there, as they say, it seemed obvious that I should make a little bit of a pilgrimage myself. So I think I was about 37, 38, and I headed off up there. And I met people there who work in the library, like Laura Smith, and I met sort of Katie Spicer, the people who run the whole shebang. And
Mm.
I sort of just started to fall for it there. I think I got the bug very, very massively. Um, when I say the bug, just there's just so much you can explore. There's so many songs, so many
Yes.
fragments that you can go and find out
Yeah.
about. And it was
Yeah.
just very natural, very comforting. And what I really loved about it was that I realised that in the town that I live in Hampshire, there was there was a guy that I didn't know very well, but I recognised him, and he was a chap called Paul Sartin, and he was a musician from Bellowhead, which were a huge folk band that most
Mm.
British folk
Yeah.
fans will obviously know about. And one day I saw him on the train coming back from London, and I just sort of went and slightly forced myself on him and sort of sat down and forced myself, got a seat, took a seat, and just started pounding him with questions, really.
Right.
Um, and we became friends. And long story short, we ended up running starting a folk club together. He introduced me to a lot of
Mm.
people. He introduced me to people like Eliza Carthy, people that are really kind of legendary within that scene. And what I
Yeah.
loved about it was
Yeah.
that they were just so welcoming. They were just so
Right.
keen to spread the word. Oh look, somebody else loves
Mm.
this music. Like I can,
Yeah.
I want to tell them all about it. There's just it's a
Yeah.
genre of real passion. People like
Yes.
Martin Simpson, who I know you
Yeah.
know yourself, and who just
Yes.
really want to tell you about all of this stuff. I don't think I've answered your
Yeah.
question.
No, I think you have, and I've actually probably forgotten what the question was. So, I guess one question I have is, for me, there's this thread of connection somehow, that you can take a very
Mm,
old song, and I'm thinking a couple of your songs, as I think we've discussed in the past. It's a beautiful song called "There Was an Old Man Came Over the Sea," and there was another one and that's one that you
mm,
recorded for this midlife album. And you also recorded a tune called John
mm,
Hobbs. And they're very, very different
mm,
subject matters, and both in their own way very tragic
mm,
songs. Um, but there's a sense of place and time, but there's also a very fresh place for them, and there's a very I think you make them personal, and you kind of inhabit them, and they're emotionally engaging. It's not just this old thing that you've performed like a Baroque performing in
mm,
society.
mm.
I'm not saying anything against classical musicians who do that, but some of that kind of very academic approach can be a bit dry. But you've really inhabited them somehow. So was it hard to make them personal, or did you just connect to them, and that was what
That's
made
a
it
really
personal?
nice setup. Thank you for saying that. And it's also it's interesting that you look at it that way. Before my kind of Damascene moment where I kind of realised that I was into this traditional music, I was very into I was very into indie music. I played in a lot of indie
Mm,
bands. I was having a chat with Jim Murray the other day, and he's just a little bit younger than me, and
mm,
we were talking about how we were both big Blur fans, but
mm,
I had been old enough to go and see Blur, and he hadn't. And so
Right.
but that I to give you an idea, I went to see Blur, I don't know, 6 or 7 times in the 90s, and it was
Right.
so
Hmm.
I was that kind of musician, that kind of thing. And so when it came to recording traditional music, I was very conscious, and still am very conscious. And I know this is something that we've talked about on Twitter and things before, but still haven't. I'm very conscious of not being quite good enough to be a traditional musician in terms of the understanding of it, the ability to play quite in the way that seasoned folkies can play.
Mm.
Um, it's interesting. The person that I got that I perhaps associate myself the most with in terms of that folk scene would be someone like Billy Bragg, who sits and I
Right.
recently chatted with him about this, and he sits
Yeah.
in his own mind. He sits on the outskirts of it.
Mm.
He thinks that he's connected to it, and what he does is definitely connected to the tradition in some
Yeah.
way, but he finds it hard to see himself as being accepted into that. I don't
I
think I'm
see.
quite as disconnected as he perhaps feels, but I certainly would associate what I was doing, and certainly in the songs that you've just mentioned, with someone like that. So when I came to those songs, John Hobbs to me, and I guess I'm giving it all away now, but John Hobbs to me is me kind of doing a Billy Bragg. It's
Mm.
in fact I when I about a year after I released Midlife, I released another version of it with a few demos on it, and you can find that on Spotify. And there's a demo version of John Hobbs, which is me and an electric guitar rather than me and an acoustic guitar, and it was just far too well. This is Billy Bragg. I am just doing a Billy Bragg here, um, and so that was scrapped, but saved, and it's not very good.
Mm.
It doesn't get many listens, but it's there, more for me than anybody else. But
Yeah.
the other song, there was an old man came over the sea. Yeah, that's an interesting one. That one appealed to me for a couple of reasons. When I first started becoming interested in traditional music, I went up to a festival called Norma Fest, which was run by Eliza Carthy and her family up in Whitby. And on the second night, that I just think it was the second night that I was there, um, Lankum played the Dublin band
Hmm.
Lankum, who've since
Yeah.
become pretty
Yeah.
huge.
Yeah.
And they played that song, and I remember being mesmerized by it. And that was it. Like, as far as I was concerned, it was an amazing song, and I bought their album and I listened to it.
Mm.
When I started doing the research into midlife and the traditional songs, I was quite amazed to find that it was from not terribly far away from where I came from. It was very definitely a
Ah,
Midland
okay.
song, and it's likely
Mm.
that it had travelled and that there was an Irish version of it that maybe they'd picked up on, and they were doing their very much their thing with it. Um,
Mm.
but it was kind of a delight to find that it would fit into that Midlands
Yeah.
selection. And so when I was going
Yeah.
about recording that, I was very conscious of the fact that it needed some atmosphere. It had to be nothing like the Lankum version. Um, I think I recorded it originally on an acoustic guitar, and then I went back to it again. And in my head, I kept hearing this sort of. It was this slightly dark, almost Pink Floyd kind of
Yeah.
thing that was just kept. Actually, the intro to my version of it is almost a direct lift of "Working Class Hero" by John Lennon.
Ah,
Guitar
okay.
lick.
Uh-huh.
Realised that afterwards.
Right.
Um, so it's an amalgamation. There's elements of in that recording of all the people that I'm influenced of. But I suppose the
Yeah.
thing is that I don't see myself comfortably as a traditional musician, but I'm a huge fan
Mm.
of traditional songs and obsessed with
Yeah.
traditional songs. And there's no reason not to give them life in a different way.
Yeah.
They don't have to sound like that kind of folky thing, I think.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you say that, and I think this is something that I'd like to talk a bit more about in a minute. But you talk about traditional music, and I think people have this image of traditional music as being some old guy stood up with uh, a big beard
Finger in
and
his ear.
making a long yeah, and making a long song about fairies or gypsies or whatever it is, and singing it unaccompanied to a bunch of old people drinking their beers. And you talk about not being accepted into the traditional kind of scene, but actually I think some of my favorite encounters with the music have been in a non-traditional way. People like Jim Morris that you've
Yeah.
talked about. Eliza Carthy herself,
she was famous for it.
you could almost put her in the punk cabaret at times.
Yeah, if you go back to
type of
Eliza's
genre.
early records, then there's all sorts. There's everything from sort of clashes with drum and bass right through to, I mean, she did that very well. I mean, I think she made her name partly in that, and you can see why, right? Because, I mean, I would assume, I've never talked to her about this specifically, but I would assume that has as much to do with being the daughter of Norma Watson and Martin Carthy and needing to make your own make your own mark in some way.
Else. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And that's not to say that she hasn't done
think
it amazingly in the traditional way. I mean, if you go and listen to the stuff that she did as Waterson Carthy, when it's just her, it's as traditional as it gets. Sorry, not when it's just her. When it's her and her parents, it's traditional as it gets.
Yeah, I love the quote, and she confirmed that he actually said it. Is that Martin Carthy actually said the worst thing you can do to a folk song is not sing it, and I kind of feel like maybe my versions of those traditional songs may not be doing them quite that much justice, but the reality is, I think that if a song resonates with you, then it doesn't really matter about whether you're part of that tradition or not, so much at least.
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, I was really conscious of it at the very beginning, and still am to this day. I still have deep doubts about what I'm doing in that area, but I think there was a point very early on when I didn't know much about it. I wondered if there were other people out there who perhaps found the stereotypical version of traditional performance a little too much to take, and perhaps would find their way into the songs if they were presented in a slightly different way. Yeah. And that I do remember thinking that. I mean, it's kind of turned its table. The tables have turned in my way of thinking about that now, because I am at my happiest listening to someone in a live situation when we're not in lockdown. In a live situation, I'm at my happiest listening to someone like Nick Hart, who. Yeah. Especially when he does this song called, I think it's called The Crocodile, and he does it unaccompanied, and you just get this strong sense that you're watching. It's almost like you're looking into a portal into the past, and you can, this must have been what it's like. I know you've either talked to, or you're going to talk to Piers as well, Piers Corley. Yes. And I think he's doing some really amazing stuff in that way. I mean, he's yet to do an album as far as I'm aware, but he's I've seen his videos and I've seen what he does, and I think you do get a sense there that, well, that is essentially what we're talking about there, is kind of what we've just sort of not dismissed exactly, but sort of said, that's what people find it hard to get into. I'm not totally convinced anymore that they do find it hard.
Yeah, I think it's very easy to stereotype people and say, well, they all just like, I don't know, ex pop singer, and that's it, But actually, young people are incredibly intelligent and musically diverse, and there's just all kinds of really good people out there who are learning the craft and who are moving it forward.
Absolutely.
And so I definitely don't mean to be dismissive, but I think for myself, I think coming to some of these traditional songs by the route of more popular forms that I would have been used to, perhaps going, when I was at school and so on, realizing that, Roy Harper sang on a Pink Floyd song, or Sandy Denny was in a Led Zeppelin song, and then you sort of think, well, who are these people? And you go and investigate. And I think if for instance, one of my favorite singers is Anne Briggs, and I think if I'd heard the album Anne Briggs first, before anything else, I think I would have struggled with it.
I get that totally.
Because it's of that particular style, the unaccompanied floor singing and so on. But now I kind of understand where it's gone, and I think that's because many people did engage with it, and someone like Jimmy Page, who was a hero of mine, kind of brought me into that, because you later find that Black Mountainside was really Bert Jansch's Blackwater
Yeah.
side, and that connects you to Anne Briggs, and so
Yeah.
on. So there's a thread of that in a lot of traditional music coming through into the influence of rock music, and I think that's
Well, I think
wonderful.
there's a certain type of person, and I know that I'm definitely one of them, and I know from talking to you right here, right now, that you're definitely one of them. There's a certain type of person who can't leave music alone, in as much as you can listen to a song, you can absorb yourself in a song, you can love a song, but that's not enough. You need to find out where that song came from. And I'm not talking about traditional songs now. I'm talking about the back of record sleeves, finding out what the artist wrote about it. And, you know, so for me, you know, I think the first album I ever bought, I was only about 8 or 9 years old, and I had my pocket money. I bought Revolver. Not a bad first album, I have to admit. I'm quite proud of that one.
That's pretty damn good.
And from there, it was the Beatles. But really quickly, I was starting to think, well, the Beatles are talking in these back of the record sleeves and in the books that I've seen, they're talking about this guy called Elvis. And even though now, you know, you look at it now and you're only talking a matter of a handful of years between those two artists. But, you know, when I was younger, it seemed like a hugely generational thing. And then you go and you look into Elvis and you look at what he was listening to, and you know, for me it was always a slightly retrogressive thing. So when I you know, I got into my early teens, my dad gave me an album of Muddy Waters. I was fascinated to find where that came in, and also where it had gone. The Rolling Stones, the Kinks, listening to Blur. You know, well, that's clearly influenced by the Kinks. So I was always fascinated by those kind of almost family trees. I mean, there was a guy, wasn't there? Somebody, Crane, I want to say. There was a guy who used to draw rock family trees. Did you ever see those?
Yeah, I think there was one on. There was definitely one on a Fairport Convention album
that's right,
somewhere, and another one I think on a Deep Purple or something like that album. And you just sort of you do realise that this stuff really is very deeply
that fascinated
connected.
me. And a friend of mine, you know, used to joke with me about it that I could never stay on one band. I always had to go and find other stuff. And I saw him relatively recently, and he said, "I see that you've got into the traditional music. Where do you go from there? Like, there's no further way back. The next place is probably like cave painting or like smashing stones against other stones and stuff like that."
Yeah. Well, the good thing is, to me at least, I mean, I'm very much a musical gadfly. You know, I'm fascinated by all kinds of music. And for me, the wonderful thing is that now we don't have to choose. You know, it's like I can be an absolute lover and geek out about traditional music all day long, and listening to your Old Songs podcast, for instance, and geek out about a particular song and all the fragments of it. And then I can be just at home as listening to, you know, a modern composer like Samuel Andreev or somebody like that, who's completely obscure to most people, but to me it's wonderful. Or listening to Kendrick Lamar or whoever it is of the day. And the beauty of that is that it's so available. It's so easy to just try it, and if you like it, then pursue it. So I don't think I could imagine just being into one form of music.
But I mean, obviously we have that luxury now. I think it's a plus and a minus, because you know, I say this to my son. My son is 16, almost 17. He's hugely into music. It's just like plays music himself. He's in a band. He's passionate. He's as passionate as I am about a different genre, but he talks in the way that you have, in terms of, you know, there's so much out there. I don't have to buttonhole myself and that kind of thing. And then he'll ask me what it was like. What was it like back in your day, Dad? That kind of thing. And the good thing I think about those olden times, the early to mid 90s, when I had a job washing dishes at the local pub and I was getting paid just enough to be able to afford an album, is that you really had to make that choice, you know. It was an investment, and so it became an investment in time. And so, you know, I can't imagine how or where you would read things like album sleeve notes these days, even though you've got the internet available to you. That kind of, you know, this is a whole other subject, but that whole curation of an album by an artist in terms of what they're presenting to you, what they want you to hear, what they want you to listen to, they give it, you're
Yeah, the order
yeah,
of
and
it.
you're
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
you're sort of heading into their time, and you're
Mm,
sharing that moment, and it's the likes of
yeah.
Spotify have uh, pluses and very, very, very minuses about them,
Mm.
but that's something that I just worry is slightly lost. But that's the old man in me.
It is, but I also think it's in a sense it's a little bit full circle because when you went back, if you look back at some of the traditional singers, they kind of had their
Hmm.
repertoire, but very few of them were ever recorded. And these songs come to us in so many different fragments and pieces. And there are early recordings, but they were in no way constructed as this album of a journey and so on. So I think that then, you'd go to a folk club and you would dip in and you would hear 5 or 6 different singers perform a few songs, and it was, to me, that's as fascinating as it is. So I'm definitely a bit like you. I used to love to just go and get a vinyl album and just read everything. And I was so disappointed if there was no inside sleeve. It was just a paper
Yeah,
sleeve
yeah, yeah.
inside it. But I do also feel like I've really just been able to discover so much just by following
Yeah,
threads. Just by
absolutely.
okay, I've been interested in. Miles Davis. Well, who played in
Yeah,
his band, and what else did Gil
yeah,
Evans do, and what did John
absolutely.
Coltrane do, and so on. But anyway, I'm coming a little bit off the topic. We're not here to talk about me.
Talk
Um,
about whatever you like.
I was going to say, but you kind of you haven't just done the sort of traditional folk music. You've also put out some stuff as
Yeah,
Grizzly Folk, some of which has been your own music and your own lyrics,
yeah.
presumably. Um, quite a large output actually of Grizzly Folk stuff, and I think you've also done some really beautiful things in there, and I don't want to make you all embarrassed, but I think some of it has been really, really, really touching and emotional in the same way as that you've brought that emotion to the other songs. But is it the
Thank you.
same for you? Is it the same for you when you write your own things as it is to perform and arrange an old song?
Oh, wow, you're opening a can of worms. I suppose so the Grizzly Folk thing goes back to yeah, in teenage years I was playing in indie bands. I was playing a lot of that kind of stuff, often with
Mm.
the same people. I went to live in Japan for a long time. Played in a weird hybrid band called Cut Flowers that was a mixture of well the lead singer was did a pretty damn good impersonation of Prince, and I wanted to be Graham Coxon, and so it was this kind of mad mashup of Britpop and Prince, basically.
Mm.
That didn't go
Super.
very far, but no, we had a lot of fun with it, and we did a little bit of touring around Japan, which was great fun. But
Hmm.
at the end of that, I was introduced to a friend of mine called John Nice, and John,
Hmm.
um, some people who are interested in the sort of not the traditional area of folk, but the sort of more the area of folk that people might argue about whether it's folk or not. John kind of lives
Yes.
somewhere around there, and he
Uh,
when we were introduced to each other, we were introduced because uh, a mutual friend of ours recognised that we probably had interest. So not just interest in terms of music, band interests, but also interest in terms of sort of home recording and all that kind of thing. We were both living in the south of Japan in a city called Fukuoka, and we didn't
mhm.
live very far from each other. We both were at the time. I was working as a freelance journalist, and John was working as a English teacher, and both of which meant that we had a huge amount of free time. And so we just started recording stuff together. And it was nearly always a case that John would come up with some interesting piece of music that would never ever occur to me. And it might be in some weird alternating time signature or all sorts of things. And it would be my challenge to sort of sit down and try to put words and melodies to it and see what had happened. And it
Mhm.
was called the Grizzly Folk because actually one of the earliest gigs that we ever did, well, a couple of reasons. A friend of ours, another friend of ours who sometimes sang with us called Richard, he, I think he came up with the name. Can't remember where from anymore, but he came up with the
Mhm.
name. But we used to perform in Japan as we would occasionally perform things like What Shall We Do with the Drunken Sailor? just to sort of
Right.
throw Japanese audiences off, and also because we found it quite interesting that these songs were so old,
Yeah.
and that you could make something of that in your performance in Japan, talk to people about this being something from your own culture,
Mm.
but we didn't really know anything about our own culture or traditional culture. These were just songs that we threw in, and I knew the wassailing song, which is
Okay.
now I know as the Gloucestershire Wassail. I knew that from
Mm.
Blur, from a B-side, not from a B-side, from a flexi disc that Blur released, fan club only. They've never released it since. It was if you had it, you heard it, and there are certain
Right.
hardcore Blur fans who know it. And so I learnt
Right.
it from there, not knowing that it was a traditional song, thinking it was a Blur song. One thing led to
Yeah.
another, and I think the name Grizzly Folk was slightly coincidental almost. We didn't intend ourselves to be particularly a folk band. I think we literally thought we
Mm.
were a little bit grisly and that we were folk. Um,
Yeah.
and and so we end up, but John and I, we play and we write and we record whenever we have time. Um,
Mm.
and as you say, we've done quite a lot of stuff. It tends to
Yeah.
be my words, my music, or sorry, my melodies set to his
Mm.
ideas and his bits and pieces. And yeah, it's got a certain style to it. And I see it a bit like, and to go back to Eliza Carthy, she has she did have, I don't know if she still sticks to it, but she had a kind of schedule where she does one album traditional, one album songwriter, or one on, one off,
Yeah.
like that. And I've
Yeah.
started finding my way into that kind of regime as well, whereby at the moment
Mm.
I'm slightly doing. Well, it's not so much that I'll do one and one. It's that if I record under my own name, it's nearly all traditional music, and if I
Right.
record under the Grizzly Folk, it's nearly always my own songs. Occasionally, I do
Right.
covers in the Grizzly Folk, but
Yeah.
almost never
Yeah.
shall the twain meet.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Japan and that you lived there, and I think the only way I found out that you've been there, we started talking about it, was that you actually covered a song
To-
called
Torianse,
Torianse,
yeah,
which is a Japanese traditional Japanese
yeah.
folk song. Um, and I found it really beautiful. I was talking to someone else about this, that sometimes a song just connects with you even if you don't know the words and if you don't really know
Yeah,
the meaning. And that's what that song did with me. It's got a beautiful melody.
gorgeous, isn't it?
It was really lovely
Thank
performance
you.
of it, and it really felt like, again, that you sort of had inhabited that. And how do you think, as somebody who's travelled a lot myself and lived in various places, how do you think that that's kind of experience of different culture and living in somewhere else? Is it something you've kind of actively put into your music, or has knowingly influenced you, or is it just something there's an undercurrent to who you are and what you do?
Um, I don't think it has a lot to do with. I don't think the music that I record has a lot to do with it. Um,
Mm.
when I lived in Japan, I played with a lot of Japanese musicians. I lived in Japan at a time in Fukuoka in the south of Japan. Fukuoka is known as, or it was known, it had this nickname as the Japanese people called it the Liverpool of Japan because it had this tendency to pump
Mm.
out a lot of pop acts. And it was a
Right.
port city, and it was, there were a few minor similarities. And there was an area of Fukuoka that was a sort of nightlife district. And I was really lucky that during the late 90s, early 2000s, when I lived there were lots and lots of bands and lots of foreigners intermingling with Japanese people. It was very open culture. And you could, on any
Mm.
given night, you could walk through that area of the town and somebody would be playing, some band would be playing. And it might be a
Right.
Japanese band doing grunge. It might be a Japanese
Mm.
band doing a sort of, a Japanese version of sort of westernized rock. It might be a band made up of a couple of Brits and a couple of Japanese. It was just
Yeah.
this huge sort of melting pot. And I was really a big part of that. I was constantly out and about uh,
Mm.
playing in those bands and running events. I was really interested in sort of putting on events and sort of trying to facilitate some of that stuff. Um,
Right.
and I'm sure it must have rubbed off in some way. I couldn't put my finger on any particular song that I've ever recorded, with the obvious exception of Torianse, that
Yeah.
is a Japanese influenced song. But I picked up
Hmm.
so much from other cultures, playing in bands there with
Mm.
Filipino guys, or playing in bands there with
Mm.
guys from the American South, and you you become a bit of a sponge if you allow yourself to be.
Sure. Yeah.
And so Toriante is more, I think, was more for my son than anything
Mm.
else, because my wife is Japanese, my kids are half Japanese. They are interested in their Japanese heritage.
Mm.
I thought it might be quite interesting to make an arrangement of it. My son is fascinated by the guitar, um, and he's sung it live with me on a couple of occasions.
Oh, wonderful. Huh,
Because
that's
he
great.
can actually speak Japanese, whereas I can only really kind of pretend to.
Right.
Uh, so yeah, it's a beautiful song. The funny thing about it is that anybody who's lived in Japan and been to Japan for any length of time will recognise that tune as the tune that the traffic lights make.
That's right. Yeah.
So when you press the
That's right.
traffic light button, or when the traffic lights go off, that tune
That's the
plays.
melody.
It's funny, if you go in one
Mm.
direction, it plays that tune, which is dark and sinister, and if you go in
Mm.
the other direction, then it plays this really jolly melody. And so you only ever really want to be going in the one direction.
It's just such a fascinating place, the way that there's just such a everything has details, everything has layers, and everything has some thought put into it, and
It
it's
really
really
does.
it's really interesting. It's very overwhelming at
Mm.
times, but it's
You
it's
spent
really
much
really
time there
interesting.
yourself, did you?
I've been there twice, and I spent quite a lot of time there in 2018, like a few weeks, really
Oh, nice.
traveling and trying to get to see things. So
Lucky.
yeah, I absolutely love it. I think it's just a wonderful
Mm.
country.
Agreed.
Yeah. Um, so coming back to something you said earlier, and I kind of want to push a bit on this button, I suppose. You talked about this kind of insecurity about what you do and about what you are to the scene of traditional
Mm.
music and so on. Tell me a bit more about that.
Yeah, it's well, I think you see it quite a lot, don't you? If you look on, the traditional folk scene, and the folk scene seems to have quite a comfortable home on Twitter, and you get lots of people that you don't really
Mm,
know personally, but you Twitter know them in
sure.
this community, and so you see it quite a lot, that sort of the phrase comes up a lot, imposter syndrome,
Yeah,
um, and I think that imposter syndrome happens from some of the really top level people right down to
definitely.
to the pond life like me. um, there you go, imposter syndrome. But I think it has to do with I think it has to do with you meet a lot of people in traditional music who grew up because their parents took them to Sidmouth Folk Festival, Cambridge, or whatever, Whitby
Mm,
Folk Festival, all these kind of things. So they kind of grew up
yeah.
with it almost in their blood, certainly in their brains.
Mm,
Um,
mm,
and it seems to me that those people are, when you listen to some of the music they make, the ornaments and the natural ability to sing these things in a certain way is completely
mm,
natural to them. It's not something that I can do at all. So
yeah.
I think there's two sides to the answer, though. From a folk sense, I find it very hard to see myself as a traditional singer, because I just can't do that. I just
Mm,
can't do the things that in my head, you're supposed to be able to do as a traditional
yeah.
singer or a traditional performer. I mean, I recognise the silliness in that before I go any further. Like, I recognise how daft
Mm,
that is, because, as we've said already, it's about putting those songs across.
yeah.
But,
Yeah.
I think it's also a mental health thing. I think it's to do with,
Mm,
naturally being somebody who has a tendency towards depression, not
mm,
not being able to accept praise, not being able to accept the idea that that anybody else would see you as anything other than a bit of a pretender. And it's a funny thing because, you know, I recognise that I came into traditional music largely as a journalist. I mean, that was the first route into it. And in my own head, I think there's this element to it where I'm sort of going, right, I've been a journalist and now I'm going to be a musician because that's where I always wanted to be. And it's not like that. I mean, what I love about traditional music is, in my relation with traditional music, is that I feel like I can provide a service to it, whether it's singing those songs a little bit in a certain way, unearthing those songs in a, you know, to a certain extent that other people might not find, or they might just stay in the archive, or writing about it, or interviewing people about it, podcasting about it. In some way, I can provide a service that I just find that far more something that I can. This goes back to the question I didn't answer from you earlier, which was to do with songwriting. I don't write a lot of songs myself because I don't feel that I've got a lot to say. And one of the things that I love about traditional songs is that I feel that a huge amount of it has already been said and better and whittled down over time. And, you know, survival of the fittest in those songs. The bad verses, the bad melodies have dropped away, and you end up with these, often with these kind of fruits. And and so to kind of spend a life in music in that service, or, you know, to come to that kind of music quite late in life and be able to provide a service to it is quite humbling. And I find that it suits my temperament a lot more than trying to force my bad love songs onto anybody or anything like that. Nobody needs to hear that anymore. But all of that's, you know, it's all tempered by this idea that certainly that I get into my head a lot, that I'm not worthy of any praise that I get, or I'm not good enough. I'm sitting on six songs at the moment for a potential next album that on a daily basis get that close to being deleted because I don't even know that it's a perfectionist thing. I think it's just an inability to accept myself as a musician.
Yeah. Oh, I totally get it. Actually, talk about close to deleting stuff. I recently had a bit of a mental health crisis towards the end of just about the end of March, and I did actually just delete a lot of work because I just felt like I was so frustrated with myself and so unworthy. And the temptation is always that you compare yourself to others. I do. I mean, I look at Martin Simpson play, or I listen to him play.
Never ever record anything and then go and listen to Martin Simpson, because you can be sitting making a recording and you're going, this is really good, I've never played quite so well, and then you put Martin Simpson on and you go, just stop.
Yeah. But, you know, the funny thing is, as you said, you know, I've talked to Martin and I know you know him. He feels the same about it. He feels the same insecurities about his music, which is ridiculous. I mean, he's probably the best acoustic guitarist in the world. And yet he still feels, you know, he struggles with insecurities.
I think most do. I mean, I think most do, and obviously we're living at a time now where it's a lot more acceptable to be able to say that. I think, you know, to be a bit open about it is no bad thing whatsoever.
It feels helpful to me. I mean, it helps me to know that there are other people. It doesn't, in some sense, it doesn't make a difference, which is, I think you understand what I mean. It doesn't convince my brain that I'm wrong, but it does somehow make me feel like, okay, I'm not quite being rational, and a lot of other people feel this, and I'm able to sort of accept that, you know, my stuff that I do is not who I am so much as it's just something that I feel a need to do, and you know, I struggle with my motivation about it. And I think one of the things I think I've struggled a lot with, and I don't know how you feel about it, is with this whole lockdown thing. Is that I heard so many people saying, "Oh, this is a great opportunity," and I actually talked to someone who said, "Yeah, it's been a great opportunity. I've come up with I'm going to come out of it with an album, and that's just wonderful." But I haven't. I fight with myself to get my pants on in the morning. I mean, it's just sometimes you just don't feel it, and then you do, and then suddenly you have this burst. I have these bursts, and then it goes down again. So does that sort of happen to you? Is that
Of
something you've
course,
found with this
I
lockdown
can't imagine that it happens
situation?
to many people. I mean, I think you have to remember as well is that when people are sort of saying, "Well, I've got a whole album out of it," that there's probably a certain amount of geeing themselves up about it anyway. Like, I think
Yeah.
we're all mentally in quite similar boats when it comes to sort of being creative. And I saw I can't remember who it was, but I saw an interesting thing the other day, a tweet where somebody was quite the opposite, saying, "Is it okay that I feel, this was somebody who'd recorded a number of, I think it was a member of Said the Maiden or someone like that, and they were saying,
Okay.
I may be wrong. Sorry if I'm wrong, but whoever it was saying that they felt they couldn't make any music, that music had become a kind of a burden to them, and especially in this time where people are all collaborating and doing all of these kind of things, it's like I just feel the pressure, the weight to do that, the pressure to do that stuff is so big, and that's okay. Of
Yeah.
course, that's okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm lucky enough
That's
that I've
it.
got a job, so I have I don't have the time to make an album, and I think my biggest frustrations tend to be that I can't, no matter how much I practice, I'm not somebody who can sit down and bang something out in 1 or 2 takes and that's done.
Yeah.
It takes me an awful long time to get to a point that I'm happy with what I've done, and
Yeah.
so the creation of something during lockdown. I've done a couple of collaborations. I've done a lot of recording, a lot of binning what I've recorded, a lot of things like that, and I've done a couple of online live things, which leave you feeling a rather flat, I'm afraid, quite a lot of the time.
Yeah.
So sorry, this has gone rather. That the energy is lacking.
No, I think it's important. It's important to say it because I think it's not obvious to people perhaps listening to the music to understand that behind that there's this whole battle of motivation and struggling with what your motivation is. I struggle with this all the time. It's like, do I do this because I love it? Do I do this because I need to? Do I do this because I'm desperately in need of validation? and the answer just might be yes. And
No, I totally agree with that. I have a little thing on my phone, like a little notification to remind myself that I have to be a good father occasionally and go back and sort of do the important things in life rather than just spend all my time worrying about what I have or haven't made, or dwelling in music and living so much through music rather than in the moment and there in the day with my wife and kids, and I have to remind myself to do that. Otherwise, I would just end
yeah,
up wallowing just far
yeah,
too much.
yeah, yeah. It's interesting. I think people often forget that musicians are more than just music. That they have lives, they have interests outside of the music as well, and very often families and so on, and various commitments and things going on with them.
Yeah.
And actually, something that's interesting about you, I think, as well, that you've been quite involved in this kind of sober, curious movement,
Well, I'm a
and
co-founder of a company called Real Kombucha. Um,
mhm,
I'm I have done that for a number of years. A friend of mine founded the company, and as a non-drinker myself, it was a natural place for me to go and be. And kombucha is a fermented tea, but when it's fermented well, it's and not too many flavors are added to it, then it can actually come out tasting like a sparkling wine or something like that. And yeah, as part of that sort of mental health struggle thing, way back when I was 30, so sort of I've just celebrated my I say celebrated. I've just passed my 13th year of being sober. And so I often say I wasn't an alcoholic, but I was certainly somebody who just depended far too heavily on drink, and I found it impossible to. I mean, I suppose what's coming out of this interview is the fact that I'm just slightly an all or nothing person. But I and I couldn't have one or two drinks of an evening out. It would always become 6 or 7. And it deeply affected my mental health and my self-esteem and all of that kind of thing. And so when I finally managed to quit, like a lot of non-drinkers, I ended up on this little journey of trying to find something to drink when you're going out and doing stuff. And I have drunk an awful lot of shit. And when my friend brought me this stuff and said, "What do you think of this?" It was quite a revelation, and so I got involved with that quite happily. Because I saw it as I find myself, I suppose, in my happiest and most comfortable when I feel that I am helping people or doing something to be of service to other people. And so my involvement in Real Kombucha was really to sort of offer people who not that I was part of a non-drinking community, but to offer that community something.
Yeah, different. It's so ingrained as well. I mean, I know in British culture, it's alcohol is a big part of it, and drinking to excess is a part of it, and also here in Slovakia where I live, it's very, very much part of the culture, and there is always pressure. There's always a pressure to drink, and I think as a musician as well, we all have that temptation. You do a tour, and every night you just drink and eat shit
absolutely
food. And so
yes,
I think it's and I think that and part of the challenge is that you kind of want to just fit with it. You want to be part of the vibe and the feeling, and I think I'm glad it's gradually changing, but I'm really glad you're doing something like that, because nobody just wants to sit there and drink water.
Absolutely, they don't.
Or especially not sugary.
Yes.
Coke and all that sort of stuff.
Out of the frying pan and into the fire. You do end up drinking a huge amount of sugary nonsense. So yeah, I mean, it's I see it as sort of it's my day job. It's something that I spend a huge amount of time involved with and thinking about. My job there is as a marketer, digital marketer. So that's from being a journalist way back when I was editing Time Out magazine in Tokyo and Time Out in the Middle East. I naturally gravitated towards what they call content marketing eventually, and that's kind of how I ended up doing what I do now. So between the hours of like 8 in the morning and 6 in the evening, I market non-alcoholic drinks, and then the rest of the time, I play and write and talk about traditional music more than anybody probably needs me to. I would say, certainly my family.
Well, please don't stop, because I really enjoy it, and I think that's probably a great place to wind this up.
Thank you very much,
Jon. Thank you so much for joining me. It's been fascinating to talk to you, and I look forward to hearing more of your output.
Not at all, and I have to say, even if you feel that you're not up to scratch as a musician, which I don't think is the case anyway, you're very, very good at interviewing. So I look forward to seeing the rest of this series.
Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
All
Cheers.
right, Jon.
Bye.
Take care. Thanks a lot. Bye.
A jolly shoemaker, John Hobbs, John Hobbs. A jolly shoemaker, John Hobbs. He married Jane Carter, no damsel looked smarter. but he caught a tartar, John Hobbs, John Hobbs. He caught a tartar, John Hobbs. He tied a rope to her, John Hobbs, John Hobbs. He tied a rope to her, John Hobbs. To escape from hot water, to Smithfield he brought her, but nobody bought her, Jane Hobbs, Jane Hobbs. They all were afraid of Jane Hobbs. Oh, who'll buy a wife, says Hobbs, John Hobbs. A sweet pretty wife, says John Hobbs. But somehow they tell us, those wife-dealing fellas, all of them sellers, John Hobbs, John Hobbs. None of them wanted Jane Hobbs. The rope it was ready, John Hobbs, John Hobbs. Come give me the rope, says John Hobbs. I won't stand to wrangle, myself I will strangle. I'll hang dingle dangle, John Hobbs, John Hobbs. He hung dingle dangle, John Hobbs.